Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Manchester is Red podcast with myself, Tyrone Marshall, and Samuel Luckhurst with me today. We are recording virtually today due to logistical reasons. It's the international break, and no, we're not international bound, but we can't make it into the office. We will be back in the office for an in-person podcast on Friday, but it is online today, just in case you're wondering any sound issues or anything like that, but fingers crossed it will all go smoothly. Going smoothly is something that's not been happening for Manchester United so far this season. Might be the international break, but they are still making news. Samuel, you're just back from a week off, and one of the first things you've done is the line this morning about John Murtough being replaced. So sort of fill us in on what's going on there and what the latest is with regards to that.
That's certainly the plan from the Ineos Group's perspective anyway. I think in March they went to Old Trafford, they went to Carrington. The presentations were put to them by the relevant staff at United. I mean, they met Richard Arnold, they met Colette Roach, Chief Operating Officer, they met John Murtough, of course, as the football director. And I think Ten Hag even said that he bumped into Ratcliffe while he was at Carrington having a look around as well. And through their due diligence, which I mean that was back in March, and this strategic review is nearing its, I think is it a year on Wednesday since it was announced, I think. So this all of this has been in the pipeline for an inordinate amount of time, and of course we're expecting some form of announcement this week from United about the Ineos Group taking a 25% stake in the club. Changes are underway, or intended changes are underway. I mean, I was told last month that Richard Arnold was definitely going, and I was also told that John Murtough was definitely going. Now, when you're given that, when you're furnished with that information, however trusted the source may be, there's always going to be an element of not hesitation, but you have to take a step back and you wonder, is this the right time to put it out? It will need more work as well, of course. And there are certain stories where you do want double sourcing on them as well. And this is one of those stories. And obviously, although I was off last week, I saw the Arnold announcement that I think Mark Kleinman from Sky News, their business editor, he said that was happening that day. Mark Kleinman has been the go-to guy for anything non-takeover related, I think we can call it now. He was the one who broke the news about the United being for sale last year. And he's been ahead of the curve with everything. He's been bang on the money. He is also proof that less is more. I mean, there was something in Private Eye recently about a timeline of stories, and it was actually quite a half-hearted timeline of the non-takeover or the takeover that some had promised, and all the stories that had been done around United being bought by Sheikh Hassim, not being bought by Sheikh Hassim. And fortunately, we're coming to the end of it now. It's not necessarily the the resolution that a lot of United fans wanted, but there are going to be key changes at hierarchical level. And of course, Arnold is going. The expectation is that Jean-Claude Blanc will become United's next permanent chief executive, with Patrick Stewart the interim. And Ineos do want a new football director of football, sporting director, whatever you want to call it, but the plan is for a new person to come into that role, which is understandable because just look at United's recruitment hit rate over the last decade. There are probably two outright successes, Bruno Fernandes and Zlatan Ibrahimovic, I would argue. Of Eric Ten Hag signings, I'd say that Lisandro Martinez has been a success, but come the end of this year, he'll have missed 4 months of club football in 2023. So even Martinez is somewhat marred, unfortunately, by the metatarsal injury that he sustained against Sevilla back in April, and clearly the surgery didn't go as well as United thought at the time. And look, a lot of those signings, the majority of those signings, have not come on John Murtough's watch. He was only appointed football director in March 2021, and during his time you would argue that the hit rate has risen ever so slightly, but even with, I mean, I wasn't one of these people who thought that Cristiano Ronaldo was a disaster for United. I mean, he scored 24 goals in his first season back, and he was the club's player of the year, and he kept Ole Gunnar Solskjaer on a job for a little while longer as well, and he gave United fans some great memorable moments in an otherwise dreadful season. But look how it transpired in the second season, how quickly it spiralled. And unfortunately for Murta, his tenure, although he oversaw the appointment of Ten Hag, which was actually a bold move at the time, and there was a dressing room clamour for Mauricio Pochettino to come in, and he credit to him, he actually ignored that clamour and he went for Ten Hag, and I still maintain that Ten Hag has probably been the best decision United have made in the last decade. He's restored the tenets of United. Last season, it seemed like the club reconnected with the fan base. They had a successful season. They have gone backwards this season, that's undoubted, but I don't think Ten Hag's tenure is a write-off whatsoever. And as I said, Martinez has been a good signing. I think Andre Onana has been a worthy signing, even though he's made some mistakes. His form has picked up of late, and the fact that he's injured is and how concerned United fans are about that is testament to his recent upturn in form. But for every Martinez and Onana, there is £146.3 million invested in transfer fees alone on Antony and Mason Mount. The Casemiro deal, which was driven by Murta, last season Casemiro was influential. This season he has been inept, and already you see a lot of United supporters, United punters talking about should they look to offload him next year if they can, because he's just not looked up to it this season. It's been a classic case of second season syndrome. Obviously Christian Eriksen was a short-term signing. I think it's been a good signing for United, but then you've got Tyrone Malacia, and the more you think about Tyrone Malacia and how he impressed Erik ten Hag when he played for Feyenoord against Ajax, well, who would he have been up against to have impressed Ten Hag? He'd have been up against Antony, which is not really saying a lot for a left back. So in terms of the recruitment strategy, it's outdated. It's not been right, signing players for the manager rather than the club. And when you're the football director overseeing that as well, you can't be surprised if with this impending investment coming in, which I think it's pretty clear that Jim Ratcliffe wants to signal the beginning of the end for the Glazer family, and that this will be a phased takeover. It could be the most excuse me, the most phased takeover in history, given the snail-like pace that the Glazers function at when it comes to decision making and taking their time over things. But Murta was an appointment, one of the first notable appointments behind the scenes by Ed Woodward. Ed Woodward was a Glazer acolyte. Richard Arnold is going. Arnold came to the club in 2007. His background is, his best work was done in commercial, and that is what the Glazers are really renowned for at United. That's clearly where their best work has been as well, what they've overseen. So you can't be surprised that these figures are being targeted. And look, United didn't get into the minutiae of why Arnold is leaving, and there's a very good reason for that, because the fact of the matter is that Ineos do not want him to be the chief executive. They feel that there's a compelling case for change to be made there, and that also applies to the football director role.
Yeah, let's move on briefly to Richard Arnold then. That announcement came last week during your week off. Listeners will notice I didn't ask Samuel how his week off was at the start of the podcast. There's a good reason for that. He doesn't want to relive the trauma of a week of illness from last week. But yeah, Richard Arnold announced last week that he is leaving. I mean, when you assess his tenure, I guess better than the previous guy is one way of summing it up. But then that's probably a low bar. He kind of empowered people like Murta, didn't he? He did admit that football wasn't his strong point. He's a rugby man, and gave power to Murta to make those footballing decisions. But he's not wholly convinced as a chief executive, and certainly the Mason Greenwood debacle in the summer was a black mark against his name for sure.
Yeah, that's when it unravelled, just the whole handling of that situation, the very fact that they were looking to integrate him back into the squad. Morally, I thought that was wrong. A lot of Manchester United supporters thought that was wrong as well, and fan pressure, fan power won in the end. Had there not been as much of a backlash from supporters as there was, Mason Greenwood would probably be playing for Manchester United at the moment. But the prospect of him coming back into the United squad and playing for the team again, just abhorred far too many supporters, and United underestimated that, and really that was extremely careless, because there have been notable examples in recent years before that where United have underestimated fan sentiment. The best example being the Super League, where they tried to pull up the drawbridge, and what happened was that United fans quite literally stormed the castle. In the case of postponing the Liverpool game that day at Old Trafford, we were both there for it, and that was probably supporters' greatest victory over the Glazer family's occupation, given that Joel Glazer hardly ever speaks, but he was more than happy to put his name to comments about how wonderful the Super League would be. And then more recently, you've got it's easy to forget it, given how much happens with Manchester United, but the abandoned move for Marko Arnautovic, which on a sporting and a moral level, again, United supporters were absolutely appalled by it. Richard Arnold was being emailed by countless season ticket holders, informing him that they would want their money back, effectively, if United went through with this deal. And what happened was that United they withdrew from it. So again, there have been these examples where United have made or certainly considered making very bad decisions, very obvious bad decisions, and they've not really given enough thought or consideration to what supporters would think of it. I think talking to the Fans Advisory Board, where those on it have to sign non-disclosure agreements, or the Fans Forum, which is a more watered down and it's a public version, the minutes are always accessible online, that was never going to wash. You're still dealing with a very tiny minority of Manchester United matchgoers there. And of course, there were some very, very specific details of Arnold's intentions with Greenwood that were leaked and reported very courageously by Adam Crafton on The Athletic. Great journalism. And from what I was told, Arnold was also furious about how it leaked, and he actually he tried to initiate a mole hunt as well to try and ascertain who it was at United. He is of the assumption that it was an employee of Manchester United who leaked the details of their intended plans, and of course in the end it looked an absolute mess. And from that point on, United don't really seem to have recovered. And you talk about what constitutes a crisis. And I think as early as September, I said after the Brighton defeat that it was fair to say United were in crisis, not just because of the results, but because of what was happening off the pitch. You had the Anthony situation, and before that, of course, you had the handling of the Greenwood situation as well. And really, I don't think Arnold covered himself in any glory with the statement he gave on the Greenwood matter as well, and some of the details that emerged from United's fact-finding of it were, quite frankly, so troubling that we didn't publish them. It would have been inappropriate. It would have been not legally sound to have done so. And from that point onwards, there's always been a sense that he's not necessarily been on borrowed time, even though it's transpired that he is on borrowed time, but he's kind of like not taking his chance. He's made a mess of it, because, as you said, when he took over from, I think it was at the start of February last year, he was very, as you said, he empowered heads of department. He wasn't trying to spin plates like Ed Woodward was. He was never going to go here, there and everywhere, getting an EasyJet flight to Barcelona to try and sign Neymar. I know obviously he did. The irony is he actually did go to Barcelona to try and sign Frenkie de Jong, and they didn't come back with Frenkie de Jong, but that was the exception to the norm. There were very few cases where his presence would be required overseas to get a deal done. De Jong, United thought they were getting, and another one, I think he did go to Amsterdam to help finalise the deal for Lisandro Martinez as well. But other than that, you didn't really see much of him, and I think really he has to see it as a success that there aren't as many pictures of him in Getty as there were of Ed Woodward either. I mean, we try and find original pictures of Richard Arnold, but he's just not. He's not as photographic in the sense that he's not as newsworthy, and has not been as newsworthy as Ed Woodward was. Ed Woodward, from the very start, people were thinking, who the hell is this guy? I mean, he was pinned down as an imposter by the Red Issue fanzine on deadline day in September 2013, and he never really quite recovered from that day or that transfer window during his time at Manchester United. Whereas Arnold, the only time we heard from him properly was that pub talk that was literally held at a pub that was filmed surreptitiously by a supporter, where you got some insight into what he wanted to do, and he was quite upfront about it. Look, John Murtaugh's the football director. You go and sign the players. I'm the chief executive. I'll sign it off. I'll push for funds, etc. And again, going back to less is more, that did make Arnold's one full season as chief executive a success. It was a success for United. They finished third. They won a trophy. They got to an FA Cup final as well, where they did go down with a fight against Manchester City. And it felt, I think, also, which you can't underestimate, is that they reconnected the team with the match goers. You felt that particularly after the 2021-22 season, where it was a really toxic atmosphere, where you had supporters telling Paul Pogba to F off, where you had fans turning on Harry Maguire because he wasn't showing enough appreciation for Cristiano Ronaldo one night. Last season, particularly after the abysmal start as well, and how apoplectic United supporters were at Brentford, where they were chanting "You're not fit to wear the shirt," to go from there to where they were in February, March, May, June time with the cup final, that was a massive turnaround. And that's what makes it such a shame that all that good work was undone with the intention with Mason Greenwood. It was, I know he would have been an expensive asset to write off, but that's really what they should have done. They should have put the moral side of it ahead of the football side. I know a lot of people listening to me at the moment will probably be possibly turning off and don't want to hear it because they disagree with it, and they think that Mason Greenwood should be playing for Manchester United. But United eventually got that decision right, but they went about it in just about the most wrong way possible. And unfortunately for Richard Arnold, his reputation hasn't really quite recovered from that. And all these exchanges that we've had with him, and like he's a gregarious guy in an impromptu setting. He knows people's names. He's made more, not more of an effort than Woodward, but he certainly made an effort, and he does put FaceTime in from time to time, as busy as he is. But ultimately, with the Ineos investment coming in, and the fact that Richard Arnold joined United in 2007, and he's a Glazer acolyte, and as recently as last month he was defending the Glazers to interested observers with some delusional or comments that are in denial, really, about how you shouldn't always believe the media. But I don't think that's ever going to wash with Manchester United supporters. It's certainly not going to wash with you or I or any of our other colleagues who cover the club.
Absolutely. That's the departures, the impending departure of John Murtagh, the confirmed departure of Richard Arnold dealt with. We'll be back in part 2 to look at what comes next for United. Welcome back to the Manchester is Red podcast. We've just discussed the departures under Ineos and their impending 25% stake in United. That is going to mean replacements. First of all, football director, sporting director, whatever we want to call this role. With John Murtagh leaving, United will need a new one. Paul Mitchell's name is mentioned constantly with this role from Greater Manchester. Was at Old Trafford a few times when Ralph Rangnick was in charge and was linked with the role then, but is actually quite friendly with Rangnick. Will be familiar to Ineos as well, having worked in Ligue 1 for Monaco, a role he's recently left. Dougie Freeman, another name that's been linked with a role at United. Done a pretty good job at Palace, I think, fairly underrated job, an interesting name in the frame. But it's an appointment they're going to have to get right, Samuel. John Murtagh was the continuity candidate probably when he got the gig in March 2021, I think, with Darren Fletcher as technical director. He'd been at United a long time, and at that time, United were always keen to kind of avoid the football directors who are very media friendly, who've been talking their roles up. But this time, it's an appointment after you've mentioned it in your piece at lunch today. The recruitment mistakes, the £1 billion plus that's been wasted. Really, they need to be getting a structure in place that can work for the long term now, don't they? Whoever that man is.
It absolutely, and in fairness to Murta, he has implemented a structure there, and that they've got a football director, they've got a technical director, deputy football director, head of recruitment, head of data science, head of transfer negotiations. These guys have all come in on Murta's watch. Head of football operations as well, with Dave Harrington joining from Everton earlier this year. So Murta has overseen this structure, but ultimately, and I'll go back to what I said, quoting Woodward a few weeks ago, if you don't get recruitment right, you're done for, to paraphrase him. And that's what was always quite peculiar at the time of Murta's appointment, in that the obvious question we had for United was 2 years ago when Solskjaer was made the permanent manager. I think the main line from that news story was that a technical director appointment was imminent. We were told that they were close to it. Turned out that it came 2 years later, and the title had changed, even though they did appoint Darren Fletcher as technical director, but they were talking about a director of football effectively. And so why did it take 2 years later to make that decision? And when it did come to making that decision, they chose someone who was staring them straight at the face every day at Carrington in John Murta. And United said that they didn't want someone who just specialised in recruitment, and they cited Murta's work in jointly running the academy, which he did for a brief period with John Alexander, the former club secretary. And I think they also pointed out his work with the women's team, because he did a lot of work in cobbling together the squad for their inaugural season in 2018-19, when they got promoted the first time of asking to the top tier of WSL. So that was their rationale for it, and they didn't want, as you said, their reasoning for it was that they didn't want these director of footballs who were just known for good signings and were very media friendly and very front of centre. And the more you think about it, the more you think that is that an ego thing. I mean, Edwin van der Sar was never ever going to go to United, not because he didn't want to. I mean, he pretty much said as much that he would want to. But when he was at Ajax, he was the chief executive. And him going to United would mean that he would have been a threat to Ed Woodward. The sporting director at Ajax, of course, was Mark Overmars, until he fell on his sword at the start of last year, I think it was. And so Van der Sar discounted, Paul Mitchell, Ralph Rangnick, all these names, they didn't want them, and it was Murta. But again, that's a contradiction of what Woodward had told us previously, that they had to get recruitment right. And if you want to get recruitment right, surely you would want someone who has got an excellent track record with signings at a big club or a club of a certain prominence, or has got an eye for talent. Like, I mean, with Rangnick, obviously, he hadn't necessarily operated at the biggest clubs, but the players that he hot-housed or he cherry-picked to take to the Red Bull group or Red Bull teams were, it was a striking list. Like an 11 of Ralph Rangnick finds is a pretty impressive list. And United in the end decided to renege on this whole thing of, if not getting recruitment right, we're screwed, and going for someone who really didn't have a great deal of experience in it. I mean, Murta would often be the guy who'd meet a player at the airport and drive them to Carrington. That was the case with Alexis Sanchez and Alex Telles. And I think there was an occasion where, when they were getting the women's team together, he did actually introduce himself to some female football agents as the director of football, even though he wasn't. But he climbed up the ranks, and he as you said, he was very much the continuity candidate. Now, the way Ineos operate, and just looking at what Nice have done with their recruitment, they've poached the guy from Lens, which happened last year, I believe it was. I can't remember his name, but they've taken the guy from Lens, and if you look at what Lens are doing, I mean, not this season necessarily, but they qualified for the Champions League last season. So clearly they had a pretty good squad team in place to get where they wanted to be. And Nice this season, I think they're second in Liga at the moment. It's a very different Nice team to the one that was just cherry picking Premier League rejects, which was never going to work. I mean, I think what sometimes it's a quote that might get brought up a fair bit with Sir Jim Ratcliffe from the Ineos book, where I think he said about he couldn't understand why Ross Barkley wasn't getting in the Nice team, how good he was, and what have you. And I think a lot of us would see that quote and think, well, if you'd watched him in England the last 4 or 5 years, you'd know why he'd ended up at Nice, and you'd know why he's now, been ended up at Luton, having been bombed out of Nice after about a year. And they've completely changed their recruitment strategy. It's going for much younger players now, and although it's Liga and although it's Nice, given the progress they've made this season, it is logical, having appointed a new chief executive and a new sporting director last year, that Ineos would want to apply that to United, where you look at the chief executive and you look at the football director. Are those individuals indispensable? No. Is there room for improvement? Yes. Why wouldn't you want to improve it? And in doing so, and should these, obviously there's going to be a new chief executive and they intend for a new director of football to come in. With these new personnel, if that elicits an improvement, Ratcliffe gets the credit. And ultimately that's what he wants as well. He doesn't want United to continue to stagnate and to languish in 6th and compete in the Europa League every season. He wants them to be the best team in England again. And to do that, you've got to make changes at hierarchical level. And as flawed as Ten Hag's management has been this season, and his signing strategy and the players that he's pushed for, United do need objective figures above him there who are going to borderline dictate what's needed. I think Rich said the other week, it shouldn't be difficult for a director of football to offer up 3 names for a certain position, and if Ten Hag doesn't like one of them, they can say, okay, we'll put him to one side, but we'll go for these 2. You're not going to agree on everyone. I think Michael Edwards was the guy who pushed for Mohamed Salah at Liverpool. Jurgen Klopp wasn't quite sold on him. They signed him for £35 million from Roma, and that at that time you'd probably say that was maybe one of the last years or seasons where it was still advisable to sign anyone from Serie A, or there was there was quite a deep talent pool in Serie A to go for. That's what I always had an issue with the Amrabat deal in the summer, and that United, not only did they go for someone who had played for Ten Hag once upon a time at Utrecht, but he was operating at quite a medium to low level in Serie A for Fiorentina. The World Cup performances, you've just got to dismiss that as misleading. If you've not heard of a player before a World Cup and he plays like a demon, the chances are his performance level is not necessarily going to be at that level at club level as well. But also Serie A has become a dumping ground for Premier League clubs, and United should know that better than most, because Lukaku, Smalling, Young, Darmian, Sanchez, they have all been jettisoned to Italian clubs, and Italy have not qualified for the last 2 World Cups. There are very few Premier League clubs that are going to Italian clubs to take their best players off them. Newcastle did it with Sandro Tonali, and look where that's got them. And although Tonali looks a good player, you'd probably say he's the exception to the norm as far as players in the Italy national team goes. Italy won the Euros a couple of years ago, which they were worthy winners, but it's a little bit like Germany at the start of the century, in that you can't overlook the decline of the team in general, and the fact they've not qualified for 2 consecutive World Cups is a black mark against them, and also a black mark against the league. It's not like the 90s or the start of the century, and where there was so much talent in Serie A, and some of the players were completely unattainable for Premier League clubs, because the way of living in Italy and the stature of the clubs and the fascination of the league, they were compelling cases to stay. It wasn't until the money started really slushing around the Premier League that there was the Premier League usurped Serie A to become the premium football league in the world. So, I mean, this has been a bit long-winded, but ultimately, United do need someone who's going to be more objective in choosing which players should come in, and also just having a long-term, consistent strategy of signing players for the club rather than the manager. Because you've got to always be prepared for the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario, of course, would be the manager is sacked. Now, if Ten Hag is sacked, there are far too many players there that a new manager who will be very, very different from Ten Hag would come in and look at and think, I do not want him, I don't want him, and I don't want him. And those players that's because those players are too aligned with Ten Hag.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the chief executive role, Jean-Claude Blanc seems to be the likely appointee there. He's working for Ineos at the moment. Former chief executive at Paris Saint-Germain, former chief executive at Juventus. That is a clear step change from the approach to that role under the Glazers, isn't it? When it's been Ed Woodward, Richard Arnold, it's been bankers, people with commercial success, money men, basically, as chief executive. And now Ineos looks set to be forcing their man into the role ahead of the Glazers, and their man is someone with a football background. And I think that's something that every United fan is going to be applauding, isn't it?
It is, and it is a massive departure from the norm for Manchester United beyond the even before the Glazers. I mean, Martin Edwards was the chairman from the late 70s or the early 80s. When these transitions happened, it was always an internal replacement. Peter Kenyon became the chief executive, I think, in 1999 or 2000, and he was already on the board when Kenyon upped sticks to go to Chelsea in 2003. He was replaced by David Gill, who was also already on the board and an internal replacement. Ed Woodward, when he replaced Gill, was already at United. Richard Arnold, of course, when he replaced Ed Woodward, was already at United. So this is a break with tradition that goes back decades. I mean, Martin Edwards was the chairman, and his predecessor was his father, Louis Edwards. And I mean, my knowledge of the history of Manchester United only goes back so far in terms of who the chairmen were. I mean, Les Olive was the club secretary in the 1960s, but as it's pretty clear that although I'm guessing here, I suspect they've never ever gone for a French chief executive and weren't of that persuasion in the 1940s or the 1950s. Back then it was the local, in the case of Louis Edwards, it was the local butcher who was running the football club. So it is quite a fascinating break with tradition, but it's that kind of boldness that United need to oversee and they need to embrace, because I think one of the issues that we always had with Ed Woodward during his tenure was that you had these mates from the University of Bristol, Woodward, Richard Arnold and Matt Judge, who had somehow come together to occupy some of the most powerful roles at one of the biggest sporting institutions on the planet. And it seemed like their preferred sport was also rugby. Now, that's not a recipe for success, and United have not been successful in the last decade since Woodward came to prominence, and then he was replaced by Arnold. So there has been too much continuity. I think David Gill, who rather inexplicably, well, not inexplicably, I mean, he's held up as this model chief executive and how great he was for United. He wasn't. He just had the very good fortune of being the chief executive while Sir Alex Ferguson was the manager. I mean, David Gill I don't think he did anything particularly impressive during his 10 years as chief executive. He betrayed the supporters as well. He said debt was the road to ruin, but then he was more than happy to jump into bed with the Glazer family and get on board with their takeover. And with Peter Kenyon before him, I mean, Ferguson was quite disparaging about him. He blamed him for cocking up a deal for Ronaldinho in 2003. And again, he was not a figure at United at that time that people were waxing lyrical about, because United, their figurehead was Sir Alex Ferguson. For as long as Sir Alex Ferguson was the manager of Manchester United, he was the figurehead of the football club. It didn't really matter who the chairman or the chief executive was, really. He pretty much did run the football club. He didn't need people in certain positions. It was almost people occupied token roles there. But of course, since Ferguson retired, United have been caught with their pants down. Really, they've been exposed, and the way football clubs run now is extremely different to how they were run back then, when guys like Ferguson or Arsene Wenger, their influence was so great that it overrode. It didn't matter who's on the board or lingering in the background. There are very few examples of that now, and even at City with Pep Guardiola, I mean, City are a club very much in Guardiola's image, but they implemented the structure with Begiristain and Soriano before Guardiola came in, and of course he's got influence that I'd say is comparable to Ferguson in terms of signings and hires, but he's earned it because he's a great coach. He's the greatest coach of this century, and he's one of the greatest managers in the game's history. There are very, very few managers in this day and age who earn that, have that clout or get that leeway in terms of the running of a football club. And United aren't going to get it with Ten Hag and whoever replaces him, whenever that may be. It's highly unlikely that manager who comes in is going to be someone who can have the seismic effect that Ferguson had or Sir Matt Busby had when he came in as manager as well. These are generational greats, and there's a reason for that. They don't come around very often.
Absolutely. That is all for part 2 of the Manchester is Red podcast. We'll be back shortly to look ahead briefly to the weekend. Welcome back to the Manchester is Red podcast. Away from Old Trafford, the big Premier League news over the last 10 days or so has been Everton's 10-point deduction for breaching financial rules. Fair to say that Goodison Park is going to be absolutely seething at the weekend. Everton are furious at the sanction, and which club takes their flaky away record to Merseyside but Manchester United? Always a lively atmosphere at Goodison when United are in town, and it's going to be doubly the case this weekend. I think it's fair to say that the Everton fans are going to be making a point against sanctions that their club feels are unfair, and it's kind of, in a way, it's made it a harder assignment than it already was for United against a team who were playing reasonably well. United's away record in what you'd call difficult places to go, I guess. I mean, their away record generally is pretty poor, but when the atmosphere is lively and it can be intense, then they've not really shown a great deal of stomach for the fight or ability to get over the line in those games recently, have they? And this feels like it's shaping up to be a pretty seismic test for them.
I mean, United have won their last 3 away in the Premier League. It doesn't feel like that, as you discussed last week. They're somehow the form team on results in the league, which is just extraordinary. I mean, that sequence, of course, is. I think it's safe to say that it was punctured by a couple of defeats, two consecutive 3-0 home defeats to Manchester City and to Newcastle in the League Cup, and then a very damaging defeat to Copenhagen. And I mean, strangely enough, I think that Copenhagen game is the best performance United have had all season in terms of their certainly the first 40 minutes of that game. The game management for probably the half an hour, 35 minutes of the second half as well. They were really impressive for 70 odd minutes that night, yet 2 capitulations at the end of both halves cost them dearly. And they're I mean, they have to win in Istanbul. I think it's safe to say. I think even if they get a draw next week, they can go out depending on what Copenhagen do against Bayern Munich. But of course, before that, it's this Everton game. I think a lot of us were looking forward to it already because it's a good test of United, and Everton have been doing well of late. It's now become, in a weekend where you've got City playing Liverpool, you've arguably got the game of the weekend coming at Goodison Park between Everton and United, purely because of the news that came out last week about Everton's 10-point deduction. And there have been some really good pieces written about it, and it's a fascinating case. And I think when the news dropped, pretty much everyone's initial reaction was, well, what's going to happen to Manchester City, given that they've got 115 charges to answer. But I'm reading Jonathan Northcroft's piece on Everton in the Sunday Times. He suggested that City was still two years away from judgment, which is, it's absolutely extraordinary. If it does take that long, I think it was in February that the 115 charges were announced. That was long enough ago, and I think even just before then, we were probably all wondering, when are the Premier League going to pull their finger out and communicate something on these charges, the alleged charges that are hanging over City, because that had been in the pipeline for a long, long time. With Everton, people have, they've generated a lot of sympathy, or garnered a lot of sympathy, it feels like, because they're Everton. They've not been a successful team in the last 30 years. They are a big club, but they're a club that have had to stave off relegation in the past couple of seasons, and there is a lot to like about them. And maybe the death of Bill Kenwright recently as well, that has that's also contributed to this quite sympathetic press I think they're getting. And they said themselves in their statement last week, they said, look, we're going to be very interested to see what you do to Manchester City, because they've cooperated with the Premier League. City have been the absolute opposite of it, which made it pretty rich when Guardiola said at the start of the season, the Premier League need to make a ruling now, tomorrow, this evening, whatever it was he said. And it would be a lot easier if City would cooperate more with the Premier League, but all the noise suggest otherwise on that. And as far as United are concerned, Goodison, they've had a few horror shows there in recent years. The most infamous one coming on Easter Sunday in 2019, where until Brentford, that was probably the nadir of the post Ferguson reign. It was an absolutely gutless performance. The performance under Rangnick as well was similarly gutless, even though they only lost 1-0. I think they only lost 1-0 that day because Everton were a bit of a shambles at the time, and the only reason that game was settled was because of the one truly committed player on the pitch, which ironically was Anthony Gordon, because as soon as he got wind that clubs were in for him, he certainly no longer wanted to be at Everton, and he's very much persona non grata in that part of Merseyside now. And Everton seem to have an identity under Sean Dyche, and it's an identity that the supporters can get behind. There was always going to be some scepticism about the appointment of Dyche, but I think they had to make that appointment at that time, and they've not exactly been cut adrift by this points deduction either. I think most of us expect them not to be relegated, and if anything, you'd advise Everton against appealing, just on the off chance that they could be hit with a more severe sanction, because their season is still eminently salvageable. Okay, they might not climb as high up the league table as they would have done with 10 more points, but they should get out of Dodge and not get out of Dodge. They should get out of the mire there in the relegation zone. There were plenty of teams worse than them to go down, so I don't think that that's going to be a concern. And it's the classic case where I'm sure Dyche will play on the siege mentality. Goodison Park can be a raucous ground. I don't think it's been too raucous going there to watch United in recent years. It's been a peculiar time for Everton since Farhad Moshiri came in as the owner, and his investment has been pretty shambolic as far as signings go and their transfer dealings, and it feels like a club that has had hope extracted from it as well in recent years. And just as it felt like they were regaining some hope under Dyche, of course this happens, but I still think that they can channel this pretty wretched negative into a positive. And as we've discussed before, United don't normally fare well in grounds which are atmospheric or hostile. Against Copenhagen, it wasn't a hostile atmosphere. It was loud. It was a good experience for us to be at as well. It's an impressive ground, the Park, and as you know from covering City there last year. But this United team, you don't sense they have the character over these next 4 weeks, with some really testing away games within that period, and this period is also bookended by 2 games on Merseyside. It's these matches between from Everton to Liverpool, which I think it's that 8 days before Christmas, I think it is. They're going to have a huge bearing on United's season, and they've got the injury list to obviously contend with as well. But even if they had a fully fit squad, you get the sense that the character that was in this team, that this squad was possibly teeming with last season in terms of character, it has certainly ebbed this season.
Absolutely. And those 3 away games next week, Everton, Galatasaray and Newcastle, are going to be vital for setting the tone. You mentioned those 3 away wins in a row: Burnley, Sheffield United and Fulham. They're kind of the sides United have beaten away from home. I think there's an argument that if United win any of those away games next week, it would be their best away win under Ten Hag. Their away record has been that poor, really, since the start of last season. They've not had anything really that you'd call maybe a standout away win, and maybe next week we'll bring that. We'll have another podcast on Friday looking a bit more in depth at that Everton game, but just one thing for the international break to touch on, and we'll probably have an update by Friday on what the situation is. But another injury concern for United, with Andre Onana coming off for Cameroon against Mauritius, I think it was, last week. Not in the squad now for their second international, their second World Cup qualifier during this break. So is probably a doubt at the very least for the weekend. Perhaps we'll see a debut for Altay Bayindir. It'd be a case of being thrown in at the deep end, I guess, and maybe an argument now that it would have been wise to play him in one of those Carabao Cup games and just give him the experience of his United debut, rather than the possibility of having to play 3 tricky away games next week, depending on the situation with Onana.
He certainly should have played against Crystal Palace in the 3rd round of the League Cup, but that was illogical. It was such an obvious game to give a new backup goalkeeper a debut against a Palace team that was completely unfussed about going out of the League Cup. That was reflected by the team they played, and then the team they played at Old Trafford a few days later when they won in the Premier League. And also, had Onana not got injured, you've got the Africa Cup of Nations coming up in the new year, where he could miss up to 7 matches, I think it is. Again, that would not have been ideal preparation for a new goalkeeper coming from a league that is not, I think it's the polite thing to say would be it's not exactly testing the Turkish league. It's not a reliable gauge of a player's quality. I mean, there have been a lot of former Premier League players who've ended up in Turkey, and there's a reason for that as well. And we've not seen what he's like. I mean, Bayindir did play against Germany last week in a friendly that they won. Turkey beat Germany 3-2, didn't they? I think in Berlin. So he has had some playing time at least at international level, but he's an unknown quantity to anyone who goes to. If he starts at Goodison on Sunday, there are going to be a handful of people in the ground that have actually watched him over the course of 90 minutes, and that's not a great prospect for United, and especially also because Onana his form has picked up of late. He's kept clean sheets. He's made some very good saves as well. The defeats United have had against Copenhagen, City, Newcastle, I don't think anybody's really pointed the finger of blame at him. He could arguably have done better for Copenhagen's 3rd goal, but looking at it again, he clearly expects Diogo Dalot to take care of that, and Dalot is dozing, and unfortunately for United, the ball is all of a sudden in the back of the net, and it's 3-3. But I think with Onana, although he's had a fair level of criticism this season because there have been some howlers, and his shot stopping technique at times is erratic and unconventional. I don't think any of us have written a piece saying that he's a write-off or United have made a mistake or that they got it wrong letting David De Gea go. I mean, there's a reason why De Gea has still not got a club, and I thought his tweet the other week with the was it the emoji over the suggestion that he could come back to United. That was just desperate, really. It's someone playing up to the crowd. It's someone who strikes me as someone who can't let go. Clearly, if he had it his way, he'd have still been at United. But I maintain that as far as what United needed as a modern goalkeeper, they got an upgrade in Onana. They've not got a better shot stopper than De Gea. There are still very few employed goalkeepers who are better at keeping the ball out of the back of the net than David De Gea. But he did stand still with other parts of his game, and although United have not really utilised Onana's distribution that much in recent weeks due to a myriad of reasons, there is still potential there, and it's rare that you talk about a 27-year-old and use the word potential. But given the state of the team and the squad, you have to imagine that when United are in a better place, they'll have a better version of Onana, and there's been a pretty good version of him in recent weeks. So, but as you say, it's it'd be quite a positive if Bayindir all of a sudden he's parachuting into the team and he's going back to Istanbul as a former Fenerbahce player, starting against Galatasaray if Onana's not fit for that.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That could be a very interesting test for him. Right, that's all for today. Thank you very much, Samuel. That's not a problem at all. We will be back in person on Friday. Hopefully Samuel's cough will have gone by then. We're back to preview the Everton game and look ahead to what is a pretty decisive week for United. But that's all for now. Do please give us a like wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe as well. Leave a review if you've enjoyed it. And we'll be back on Friday.